So I'll start by saying that this meeting is recorded, and also the discussion that follows Professor McKitterick's talk will be recorded and uploaded to the forum's social media page that will be up in the air soon. A few words about our forum. The Israeli Forum for Early Medieval Studies is a recent initiative meant to bring together scholars and students of the early Middle Ages in Israel and beyond. The forum offers a platform for the presentation of leading studies in the field and the exchange of ideas. We will meet on a monthly basis. Our next meeting will take place in the end of April, and I will say a few more words about that in the end of our meeting today. I'm honored to present Professor Emerita Rosamond McKitterick. She hardly needs an introduction, and so this is a very partial list of highlights. Professor McKitterick is a leading historian of the early Middle Ages and a prominent scholar of the Frankish kingdoms. Her research has opened new ways to understand and interpret the early medieval past, and particularly the way in which the past was constructed and used by contemporaries. Her work uses close analyses of medieval manuscripts to illuminate cultural, social, political, and religious aspects of medieval society. Professor McKitterick earned her PhD and a Lit.D. in medieval studies from the University of Cambridge. Since 1999, she has held the chair in medieval history in the Cambridge University's Faculty of History. She is a fellow of many leading institutions, such as the Monumenta Germania Historica, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the Medieval Academy of America. She has been awarded many honors and prizes for her work. Her publications include, among many, many others, books such as The Carolingian and the Written Word, Perceptions of the Past in the Early Middle Ages, Charlemagne, the Formation of the European Identity, and today she will speak of her latest book, Rome and the Invention of the Papacy, the Liber Pontificalis, issued by Cambridge University Press in 2020. If you wish to ask a question, please send me, Shacha or Linsky. I know I have a funny name, easy to remember. So send me your name in a private message, and then I will ask you to ask your question, or your question if you want me to ask it. And now without further ado, Professor McKitterick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Shacha. And thank you all for coming from all around the world. I saw some of your names coming in and just want to say hello. It would be lovely to see you properly, but virtually is better than nothing. And it's a great honor to launch your new forum. And I wish the Good Ship Forum of Early Medieval Studies every success and happiness and no getting stuck in any canals. One of the positive things, as you know, about the COVID-19 pandemic, and there aren't many positive things, but this kind of event is one of them. And so it's another extra way to celebrate, I think, some of the happier things that have happened in the last year. Shacha asked me to talk about my new book. She also said that I couldn't assume that many of you had read it. So that's what I have assumed, but I hope that you will read it in due course. But I think I should explain at the beginning that it had a very long gestation period in many ways. And there were two major elements to this. The first is what Shacha has already mentioned, my interest in history writing and my examination of many manuscript traditions of history books read in the Carolingian period. One of those was, in fact, the Liber Pontificalis, but I'll come back to that. And some of that work in the past was related in due course to the research for my history and memory and Charlemagne books, which Shacha has already mentioned. And also as part of the HERA project, Cultural Memory and Resources of the Past, which I was lucky enough to be part of between 2010 and 2013. But already back in 1997, I had done some work on Vienna Österreichische Nationalbibliothek Manuscript 473, which is one of a great number of composite history books produced during the Carolingian period, in which the Liber Pontificalis is presented as a history of the popes in conjunction with the history of the Franks. And the presentation in that book made it look as if the Liber Pontificalis and the history of the popes, and indeed a special edition of the history of the popes, which again I'll come back to, was actually closely integrated into Frankish history. The second element of all this was a love affair with the city of Rome that began when I was a student and visited the city, and then was steadily enriched on every subsequent visit, not least with 2 long periods of residence I was lucky enough to have, one in 2002 and the other in 2011, one in the Valle Giulia and the other on the Janiculum Hill. And research and love came together in a complex tandem with a special subject that I organized on the city of Rome and its rulers, 476 to 769, that I taught in Cambridge in my final years in office, and the special subject is done by 3rd-year undergraduates. I had a succession of cohorts of outstanding and wonderfully enthusiastic undergraduates, and apart from the lectures and classes on the written sources in Cambridge, I also conducted very packed 3-day field trips in early January in Rome with each year's cohort. And in fact, we walked our feet off every year. I'm having problems with my computer. These were photographs taken by them on different years of the groups. So together with these groups, we extended our knowledge from the texts into the physical remains of early medieval Rome: buildings, frescoes, marble floors, brickwork, statues, and mosaics. And the special subject precipitated also my participation in 2 collaborative volumes, Rome Across Time and Space, and the Old St. Peter's volume about the basilica before it was destroyed in the Renaissance. It also led to a number of studies about the Liber Pontificalis in particular, and what I was beginning to realize was a very problematic and very particular representation of the development of many facets of the Pope's rule in Rome. And that is what led finally to the book that was published last June. Now, in my view, the historiography for the period from the 5th to the late 8th century had tended to see Rome more from the outside in, and as dominated by external secular powers. First, the Ostrogoths in the aftermath of the deposition of the last Roman emperor in the West in 476, then Byzantium in the common understanding of the consequences of Justinian's wars in Italy in the middle of the 6th century. I concentrated instead on Roman sources and looked at the question of who ruled Rome, but from the inside out. The invitation to give the James C. Leyden lectures in Dublin in 2018, however, offered the opportunity at last to bring all these various strands together and present not a history of the papacy, but instead an examination of how the historical narrative known as the Liber Pontificalis constructed the popes and disseminated a particular representation of their history, their role, and of the city of Rome within Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. So in my book, I explore the power of a text in its context. In this instance, the shaping of the perceptions and memory of Rome and its many layered past throughout the early Middle Ages. So in other words, I explored how the text, the Liber Pontificalis, invented the papacy. I analyzed the way a particular text can record and determine perceptions of the past and thus shape memory subsequently. And I look at the text's distinctive representation of the popes and their role as successors of St. Peter. I also trace how the text creates the city of Rome itself as a holy city of Christian saints and martyrs. And lastly, I looked at the early medieval production, dissemination, and reception of the Liber Pontificalis. So here's an outline of the contents. As you see from the slide, it's got 6 chapters, and these are the themes that I've just mentioned. So the transformation of the city of Rome, the apostolic succession of the popes, and the building and establishing of churches in honor of the saints, the significance of the chronicling of the papal contributions to liturgy, law, doctrine, and the establishment of papal authority, and the implications of the early manuscript evidence. But before I go into any detail about any of these topics, and for those of you who may not be very familiar with the text, let's explain what it is. So the Liber Pontificalis is an historical narrative in the form of chronologically ordered serial biographies of the first 112 bishops of Rome from St. Peter up to Stephen V. So he died in 891. But it is not a late 9th century text. Although we do not actually know precisely who wrote it, when exactly it was written, where, or by whom in any particular detail, and we don't know how it was distributed either, though we can work out some of that. My own view is that it was produced, first of all, the first section of it in Rome in the first half of the 6th century, and I think circa 535 is the most likely. It was then resumed and updated again by anonymous officials within the papal administration in the 7th century. So that's the bit you can see on the screen, LP2, A, B, and C, whereas the first bit is LP1. And then it's continued thereafter into the 8th and 9th centuries. And sometimes these biographies of each pope were added in batches, or sometimes simply life by life. Very, very occasionally, we can even track lives that were started before a particular pope died. Now, each pope's biography in this whole setup is structured in a similar way. The examples here are from Callistus to Fabian or Fabian with the name and natio. You can see it in the top left, Callistus natione Romanus. Then it can be understood as where he was born or what his family origin was. Then there's an account of his parentage, the length of his reign, his election, his career, or one or two particular actions. In this case, you can see that Callistus built a basilica on the other side of the Tiber, and he also inaugurated particular forms of fasting. Now, the buildings mostly are mentioned only from Life 34 onwards. Pope Sylvester, those you see from this example from Callistus, there very occasionally are some earlier. Then there's a formulaic section at the end, which gives details about the ordinations, hic fecit ordinationes there. Then there's an account of his death and his burial, and finally, how many days or even months or years, in some instances, of vacancy there was before the next bishop. As you see from this slide, the format for papal biographies emulates the early serial biographies of emperors, presenting the subject's name, origin, and career before he took up office. His election, his career in office, such as legislation, public works, building, patronage, and religious activities, his death and burial, and the length of his reign. And in choosing this particular imperial format for their history, it seems that the compilers of the Liber Pontificalis were making an obvious ideological as well as historiographical point. The format acquires even greater significance when we consider the text's initial production. I mentioned earlier that I thought circa 535 was the most likely. I have to admit that everything about this particular text is disputed, not least the date of its origin, but I've argued that it was first produced in to coincide with the first phase of the Ostrogothic Wars, when the armies of the Eastern Emperor Justinian invaded the Ostrogothic kingdom that had been established in the former Roman imperial territory in Italy. Now, this slide is a bit of Life 59 of Pope Agapetus, in which the Emperor Justinian prostrates himself before the Pope, and thus provides a fitting climax to this first section of the Liber Pontificalis, if the Pope is asserting himself, as it were, in the face of Byzantine aggression. By the second half of the 6th century, Italy was divided between 3 authorities. This map isn't quite right in my view, but never mind, it's good enough for the purpose. We have the Pope and secular administration of some kind based in Rome, the Byzantine government based in Ravenna, known as the Exarchate of Ravenna, and the various Lombard duchies, which comprised the Kingdom of the Lombards. It remains a major problem to establish how much real, as opposed to nominal or hopeful political authority, the Byzantine Exarch of Ravenna or the Emperor in Constantinople exerted over Rome during the next 200 years. But what we do know is that the Pope consistently asserted his spiritual authority and his leading position in matters of doctrinal orthodoxy within the entire church, often in fierce opposition to what was going on in Byzantium or Constantinople. In this highly charged context, the Liber Pontificalis and its production assumes enormous significance, for it seems as if the popes were seizing their moment, offering a statement about the see of St. Peter and its bishop as the new rulers of Rome, in the guise of a presentation of the history of the bishops and the formation of the Christian church in Rome. The text, as I've mentioned earlier, was deliberately designed to emulate imperial history, but it also could be read as a continuation of the Acts of the Apostles, because it takes up the story with St. Peter and continues his story after we hear about him in the book of Acts. In the text, the history and identity of the city and people of Rome itself were gradually transformed, along with the way the imperial past is presented. Now, every life, especially from life 34 onwards, has a wealth of information about particular buildings and acts of patronage. That's often what people think of when they're thinking of the Liber Pontificalis. So art historians love this text. From Pope Sylvester and the Emperor Constantine I's conversion to Christianity in the 4th century, there are ostensibly faithful details about building and ornament, but these must be read critically in the context of the overall purpose and content of the text. The text creates an image of a holy city of Christian martyrs alongside and organically developing from the antique and imperial past. It also presents an overwhelming impression of the Pope's role in church building within the city, replacing the Roman emperors as the city's major benefactors. And we know from other sources that, of course, the text is giving us a false impression of the Pope's monopoly, but that's actually one of its purposes. Now, that said, the historical evidence in the Liber Pontificalis is often unnervingly and frustratingly selective and telegraphic, especially if you think of it being written at precisely the same time when we have very sophisticated theological, pastoral, and exegetical treatises, sermons, and letters produced by the popes who form the subjects of the Liber Pontificalis. Despite its brevity, however, the Liber Pontificalis nevertheless cleverly packs a remarkable amount of carefully chosen and constructed historical detail in order to make particular points. One is the consistent juxtaposition of the imperial monuments and the new Christian buildings, and sometimes even the conversion of one into the other, such as the consecration of the Pantheon as a Christian church at the beginning of the 7th century. Another way that they choose and carefully highlight particular details is the prominence of the people of Rome in the narrative, as witnesses or as crowds of protesters, as enthusiastic supporters of particular candidates for the papal throne, as participants in processions and ecclesiastical rituals within the city, such as those introduced by Pope Honorius, as recipients of papal food distribution and other forms of welfare provision, as sufferers of privations, floods, disease, famine, and enemy attack, and as the beneficiaries of particular public works, such as fountains, accommodation for the poor, improvements to the city's water supply, repair of the city walls, and pastoral and administrative organization, as emulators of the Pope in the role of as benefactors of church buildings, and even in providing burial places for particular popes in private cemeteries. The text acts, therefore, and was possibly even designed to act as a virtual Rome for its readers, displaying a Christian city grafted onto its imperial foundations and mapping it in a narrative for those who had not seen, and indeed might not ever see, the city, especially those who lived north of the Alps. The most famous of the stories of support from the people of the city of Rome for the popes is the story of Pope Cornelius in the middle of the 3rd century, who, so the text goes, I quote, at the request of a certain lady Lucina, took up the bodies of the apostles Saints Peter and Paul from the catacombs at night. In fact, first of all, the blessed Lucina took the body of St. Paul and put it on her estate on the Via Ostiensis, close to the place where he was beheaded. The blessed Cornelius took the body of St. Peter and put it close to the place where he was crucified, among the bodies of the holy bishops at the Temple of Apollo on the Mons Aureus on the Vatican at Nero's palace on the 29th of June. The shrine of St. Peter, then apparently created, became the site of the magnificent Basilica of St. Peter's, founded by the Emperor Constantine. This picture is actually on the wall of the church of San Martino ai Monti in Rome, because the Basilica, as you know, isn't there anymore. The Basilica was founded by the Emperor Constantine, though, of course, there's been considerable discussion about the whole story, as well as the chronology and the location of the burial of St. Peter. In the Liber Pontificalis, however, it is Peter's career that provides the foundation story for the Church as a whole. It offers many aspects of Christian identity, so I've put it in summary on the slide for you, and all these are developed further in the text. Peter's teaching, his organization of the clergy, the sharing of the stories of the Gospels and placing the Gospels both as central to the Christian faith and confirmed by St. Peter, the recognition of both the letters of St. Peter as part of the New Testament canon, the dramatic affirmation of faith in the face of imperial persecution, culminating in Peter's execution, the rejection of Simon Magus's heretical views, as an indication of St. Peter's maintenance of Catholic Orthodox faith, Rome's primacy in relation to Antioch and Alexandria, and finally, Peter's major cult site in Rome. The life of St. Peter also spells out Peter's provision for the succession, with his appointment of Clement, reiterated in the life of Clement that you see here, preceded by the lives of Linus and Cletus. In some later lists of popes, you won't find all these names, by the way, in the first 6 or 7, because there's disputes, but this is what the earliest manuscripts say. Now, the Liber Pontificalis also provides a narrative about the Christian community of Rome, its many martyrs and martyred bishops under pagan emperors, got a list of them here, and the leadership of Pope Sylvester and his successors under the Christian emperors. It was from the 4th century onwards that Rome's topography was transformed, with many new buildings as well as converted old public buildings, both within and without the walls, created to honor the Christian saints and accommodate Christian ritual. In structure and materials, these marvelous buildings, many of them still visible in Rome, evoked an ancient and imperial past, but simultaneously offered new spaces with new functions. Images of Christ and his saints and of the popes, as you can see from the examples here from Santi Cosma and Damiano, San Lorenzo fuori le mura, Sant'Agnese fuori le mura, San Paolo fuori le mura, and the Lateran baptistry. In all of these, there are decorative sequences of new and recycled marble columns, elaborate floor and wall mosaics, and revetments, and extended series of narrative cycles illustrating the biblical and hagiographical texts of the Christian religion. So here we have John IV, who built a church for the martyrs, St. Venantius, Anastasius, Maurus, and many other martyrs. These were saints from Dalmatia and Istria, where that's John's origin as well. And he built this in the Lateran baptistry with a special oratory. And the pictures here are taken by Ginevra Kornblut, who was kind enough to let me use the image for the cover of my book as well. One of the most dramatic sequences of frescoes provided by the popes are those in Santa Maria Antiqua in the Forum. And some of these, according to the Liber Pontificalis, were provided by Pope John VII, whose portrait here is on the right. And that's in the grottos, even now, in St. Peter's, one of the few that was rescued from the old building. The frescoes of Santa Maria Antiqua were lost to sight until circa 1900, and since then have been subject to major restoration work. You can see them now if you go to the Forum. Well worth visiting Rome, if for no other reason than that. Now, the 6th century authors and later continuators of the Liber Pontificalis also constructed a chronology of the Pope's contributions to doctrine, or ecclesiastical organization and law, the structure of the Christian year, and the liturgy. They provided moments and particular bishops who are supposed to have introduced particular aspects, which certainly by the 6th century were familiar and thereafter became embedded in people's understanding of the contributions the popes had made. All of these served to make a powerful historiographical case for the authority of the Pope. The first that we've got here is the Legislative Synod in the manuscript from Leiden on the right. But there are many instances of legislation in the other biographies, prefaced with the words "he decreed" or something similar, so "hic constituit." Then there are the particular claims made for the Pope's responsibility for adding to the liturgy, especially of the Mass. Here, Telesphorus and Symmachus, for example, are recorded making decrees about the Gloria on the night on the Lord's birthday, and then every Lord's Day and on feasts of the martyrs, the Gloria to be sung later on. And here we have Sergius I being credited with introducing the Agnus Dei into the liturgy, or at least singing the Agnus Dei. And we can discuss afterwards, if you like, the implications or the importance of he laying it down that they should sing, "O Lamb of God, who takest away the sins," plural, of the world, have mercy upon us, because in St. John's Gospel, it's sin singular. Then also the Marian feasts are part of the Pope's contribution, and the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, which is attributed to them, Cornelius and then Sergius again. And many of the churches in existence by the end of the 8th century, represented by the category of saints to whom they were dedicated, as you see on this map on the right, are credited to the popes either as foundations or as places they endowed with many gifts, or to which relics of the saints were translated, especially from the catacombs outside the walls into the city. Now, an obvious question about any text from any period is who had access to it and who read it, as well as how they might have read it. When working on this book, I tried to understand the text's transmission and reception by looking at every early medieval manuscript up to the end of the 10th century containing the full text, the abbreviated versions of the text, which are known as epitomes, and also reflections of papal history incorporated into as many canon law collections as I was able to have time to look at. The map here, and Eric Rosamond in Utrecht drew this beautiful map for me, shows the early medieval manuscript transmission of both the full text and the epitomes, as well as references to the Liber Pontificalis in library book lists from the 8th and 9th centuries, and clear knowledge of the text reflected in local institutional histories of abbots and bishops. And also, to some extent, clear use made of the Liber Pontificalis by other early medieval authors. Now, as you can see, it's immediately obvious from the map that it's oddly weighted in favor of the Frankish kingdoms north of the Alps. Very few early medieval manuscripts are from Italy, and not one manuscript of the text actually written in Rome, that we can be sure was written in Rome, survives from before the 12th century. I thought I would talk about one of these early fragments in a little bit more detail, just to give you an idea. These are some of them. The Naples fragment, which alas is barely legible. It's one of the best pictures I could find of it. There's a little bit in Turin, and then the lost Farnesianus is probably actually 9th century, but hasn't been seen since the 18th century. But I want to talk about the one on the top right briefly, the Verona Manuscript. Now, this manuscript is actually mid-6th century, so it's the earliest extant manuscript containing a text of the Liber Pontificalis. And I say a text in that way because, as you can about to hear, it's slightly complicated. What we've got here is the end of the life of Anastasius and the beginning of the life of Symmachus. We have just a little bit more, wrote a letter backed up with so much corroboration, etc., and then Symmachus, and then we have details about Symmachus. Now, you only need to compare that briefly with the text of the Liber Pontificalis that we have received to realize that actually they don't match. This is a different text. It's not hugely different, but it is different. One of the interesting things about it is that it actually gives you a slightly different impression about the life of Symmachus himself, in that the detail about the law case is much more pointed in this particular version. That there was a case of the disputed election of Symmachus brought to King Theodoric the Ostrogoth. The charges against Symmachus and the accusations are given in a bit more detail, and many of the bishops and senators went to his defense in order to consider the legal issue of whether a Roman pontiff could be judged, yet he was judged. That section of it is omitted in the version that we have got. Now, one of the problems is that we don't know whether this is an alternative version of just this life, or whether there was an alternative version of the whole text from St. Peter onwards, or whether this was the real one and the other one we've got is a revised version. Those are questions we can't completely answer. The question about the whole text might be answered a little bit more easily. If we look at this particular bit of it, it's the end of the life of Symmachus in this section of the manuscript. And if you look at the bottom right, you'll see other popes listed: Hormisdas, John, Felix, Bonifatius, another John, Agapetus, Suerius, and then the next page over is Vigilius. And then a new text starts, and that is the De Viris Illustribus of Jerome. And then right at the end, after the De Viris Illustribus, what we have got is a series of short narratives and papal letters concerning the Acacian schism. But if we also look at this particular manuscript, we see that in the section of the De Viris Illustribus, we have a note that that is the end of Quire 3, and yet the modern or the later binder has put a C to mark the beginning of Quire 3. In other words, a quire is missing. A quire is missing at the beginning. And it's possible, if we work out the 8-leaf quaternion and one further leaf, that 18 pages are missing before we get to Anastasius and Symmachus, and that at 25 lines per page is 450 lines of text. And if you assume, and you have to assume that to fit it in, that some abbreviation took place, say in Live 34, then it would be possible, in fact, for an entire text of the Liber Pontificalis up till then to have been once in this manuscript. So what we might be able to assume or work out, if we pay attention also to the other contents of the book, is that we have a Liber Pontificalis, De Viris Illustribus, which also begins with St. Peter, and then lots of narratives and papal letters concerning the problems of doctrinal schism with the Constantinople and the patriarchs at the time, which would make this text and this whole book become a complete dossier of testimonies to orthodoxy, authorial legitimacy, and papal leadership in the middle of the 6th century. So that one manuscript still has puzzles and things which cannot be settled, but I think it gives you an idea of some of the interest there is and importance of looking at each manuscript witness to see what one can get out of it. So if I just revert briefly now to the remaining manuscripts, just to give you an idea before I finish. The recensions of the Liber Pontificalis are usually divided into 5 principal families, called very boringly A, B, C, D, and E. And they are called that because this appears to reflect the degree to which the text was adapted for local consumption in the manuscripts that we have. So A and E are Italian. So A is in Lucca and E is the Farnesianus I've mentioned already, a few fragments from earlier. The B, C, and D recensions have been identified as Frankish, dating from the late 8th century onwards, called Frankish because they contain interpolations of Frankish material in the 8th century that are only in codices of Frankish origin from the late 8th and the 9th centuries. So in this one, you've got a list of Frankish bishops who attended the Synod of Rome in 769 at the Pope's invitation, which is only in this manuscript. Many of the Frankish interpolations seem to me to reflect knowledge and people associated with the Frankish court, and I've suggested in my book that the possibility that their composition and insertion into the text can be credited to writers at the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, where this particular lovely copy of the Liber Pontificalis was probably copied. One can also look at codicological context. I've already mentioned the Vienna manuscript, which started me off way back in the 90s, but this particular abbreviated version of the Liber Pontificalis includes canon law and papal letters and decretals, and that is a particular association in which the narrative of the popes is juxtaposed with legislation which can be related to the popes or is part of the context of their insistence on orthodoxy. Further, the distribution of the text after Life 94 of Stephen II in the middle of the 8th century gets thinner and thinner. Very, very many fewer manuscripts survive of the later lives. So you can see from here that by Life 100, we've only got 5 extant manuscripts left, and we only have the last one, Stephen V, surviving in a codex from Fafa from the 11th century. So as history writing, the Liber Pontificalis was pioneering, essentially transforming an archive into an historical narrative, and distilling the essential elements that the authors wished to communicate to an extended audience. Certainly, it's a précis of a vast compendium of information that existed at the time, even if in many instances, all we've got now is the short summary. And the other aspect is that no other narrative gives such prominence to popes. This is their history. They are active agents in the gradual development of the papacy as an institution. That's how they're presented, and thereby they are presented as the core of the Christian church. In the insistence on apostolic succession, anchoring the Christian faith in the work of St. Peter and his successors, the Pope became the logical continuation and institutionalization of the work of Christ and his disciples. It both chronicled and is in itself an instrument for the transformation of Rome from imperial to Christian capital. Its general importance for us is how it shapes the time and context in which it was written by means of a particular representation of the past. And as I've stressed in my book, there's a constant tension between the representation in the text and the reality in interpreting historical evidence of any kind. Specifically, the text was designed to shape the cultural memory and a particular understanding of the popes and of the city of Rome. So this invention of the papacy articulates an understanding of the popes that was repeated and extended throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And just as a coda, not in my book, but as an extra, I thought I would show you a couple of things of what happens next, because it precipitated a particular kind. One of the things that this plays into is what actually precipitates a particular kind of history at a particular moment. It remains a particularly intriguing problem for all of us. And I've attempted to answer it for the earlier lives, but then we have to account for why it doesn't get written at other moments and why then it is continued at other moments. So we've got very, very little from the 10th century. There are some 11th century editions of the Liber Pontificalis, which sketch in a few basic details about successive popes in the 10th and 11th centuries. But it isn't until the late 11th and in the 12th century, coinciding with the major reforms, that huge efforts were put into promoting papal authority, and contested elections were there. So there's again an interest in reading and writing papal history. We have important canon lawyers such as Deus Dedit and Anselm of Lucca, who wrote accounts of popes to make political points, and Bonizio Sutri in his Liber ad Amicum, who wrote soon after the death of Gregory VII, who I think is one of my least favorite popes, and gave accounts of Gregory's immediate predecessors, and followed the Liber Pontificalis structure in so doing. Opponents of particular popes wrote short accounts of some of the contemporary popes and the conflicts, and Duchesne made an assembly of such diverse material, which he found in a manuscript of the 12th century. But Duchesne also identified what he described as a new edition of the Liber Pontificalis, continued to Honorius II in 1130 in a manuscript of the mid-12th century in the Vatican, possibly the work of a Roman cleric called Pandolf, and redacted by someone called Pierre Guillaume of Saint-Gilles. And it used the original Liber Pontificalis, adding occasional phrase to the older lives, but then abbreviating from Paul I onwards. To this same manuscript material from the 12th century, we get more added in the 14th, and we get later manuscript copies which do similar exercises, one in the left, now in Brussels, that's not been worked on much at all, and the one on the right, which is much more famous. There are a number of 15th century redactions until we have the work, finally, of Platina and also of Pamdenius, and then the later editions, which have all been written up very, very well indeed by Stephan Bauer. And one of the interesting things of these is that although they write very, very different versions of the later lives, this core, which I've been talking about this afternoon, and which I've studied in such detail in my book, remains the core. It's not altered much at all. It really is the foundational element of the books of the popes. So I'll stop there. I'll go back to not sharing, shall I?
Yeah.
Unless you want to carry on looking at the pictures.
Yeah, no. I think it would be nicer to see you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this marvelous talk. Very, very interesting. So I remind you, if you have a question, please text me your name. Let's see. Nicola has a question. Where are you? I'll even unmute you. Just a second. I'm sorry for these. Here. Okay, Nicola, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Hi. Thank you, Professor McKitterick. I appreciate the talk and the book, and of course, all of your work. My question is related to these continuations of the initial text and what it is that triggers that, what inspires these four major waves of continuation that you pointed out for the medieval period up to the Carolingian, well, beyond the Carolingian period. I'm curious in part because I've had the same problem in the visual form of the Liber Pontificalis, that is to say, the cycles of papal portraits, in particular at St. Paul's, that I've worked on. And I've always been intrigued by what inspires the continuation of the cycle over the course of time. So I wanted to ask you this question about what inspires, what triggers someone to pick up this project and update it.
Well, thank you very much. And if I may take the opportunity of thanking you for your book, which arrived just as I was piecing my lectures together, and I was thrilled to bits with it. So thank you. And anyone who hasn't yet read Nicola's book on San Paolo fuori le mura, please do it. And look at his wonderful website where he's reconstructed the thing. I think it's the precipitating factor in the 7th century may have to do with the post-Pope Gregory I era. And sometimes I think it's very closely related to doctrinal challenges, if you like. But I'm still puzzling out exactly why people might have done it later. Your mention of the San Paolo portraits is really very interesting because, as I understand it, but you'll know this better than I, it more or less coincides with the work of Pandolfus to extend the history of the written history. Is that right? Chronologically?
Well, so Pandolfus is 12th?
It's 12th century, yes.
No, so the continuations I have that we know of would be under Leo the Great.
The first, 5th century.
And then there is this strange presence of Pope Lawrence, the anti-pope. Yeah. So one presumes some kind of continuation, maybe even under him. So that's around the year 500. And then we have silence about when that might have been, but presumably all the way, the last set in the nave go to about the year 8. I think it's Gregory. So no, it's Zacharias, Pope Zacharias.
So it's 8th century.
And then silence until they fill out the cycle in the transept, but that's in the 18th century. So 18th, yes.
Oh, good grief.
That's when they pick it up and say, okay, where do we leave off? And they decided that they missed about.
Well, that would coincide better with the Bianchini and Vignoli efforts to edit the new editions of papal history. That does.
Bianchini is intimately involved in that.
Yeah,
yes.
that has a close link. With the others, it may well simply be that you're getting increasing challenges. I mean, if there is indeed, from what you say, for the 8th century lives, each one is written on a life by life basis, most of them. One or two might have been waited until there were 2 popes gone. There's also the problem with the life of Stephen III, which incorporates at the beginning what appears to have started out as the first portion of the life of Constantine II, but then when Stephen III dealt with Pope Constantine III and Pope Constantine II and deposed him, then that actually is subsumed into the life of Stephen III. So that there are moments when the popes are challenged by particular factions or particular doctrinal and spiritual challenges, and those may be the moments, but I think you would need to look at each one. I think it would also be fair to mention that at the beginning of the 6th century, Deborah Delianis has made a case for the Liber Pontificalis having been something that's related much more closely to the occasion schism, whereas I have suggested that it actually is a much more politically oriented one and is the reaction to basically the falling away of Ostrogothic authority. So that the 8th century lives initially may not for you bear such a, they may be more immediate, in other words, in terms of filling in gaps. But do you get the impression that between Lawrence and Zacharias, there is then an attempt to fill in all the bits in the middle?
That I know, there's only an effort that is at the end of under Nicholas III in the 1270s, an effort to re-begin the cycle again. And there's a whole new Peter, another Linus, they all get put in again, right above the arches. But
well, that
one doesn't go all the way that we know of to 1270. So that's a strange re-beginning, repetition rather than continuation.
Huh? Well, I don't know whether anyone else has got suggestions to make. Larry is sitting there, others, especially those more familiar with the later Middle Ages. As you know, I don't do 4-figure dates as a rule, so any offers? I mean, there are arguments. Richard Corradini has written a really nice piece about particular crises precipitate particular historical narratives. And I think it's at least something we need to think about every time we read a historical narrative of what made that particular person sit down at that particular moment and write a history in that particular way. But some of these may well be people just thinking, oh, well, I've been thinking of doing this for quite a while and I will eventually get around to it. But I do think we need to think about it at least.
Itzik, you have a question? You're on mute.
Not really a question, but I would like to strengthen Rosamond's political view of the beginning of the Liber Pontificalis. I think it coincided with other things that goes on in Ravenna/Verona at the time of the fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom, and you can see that in the manuscripts of Verona, the Sacramentum Veronensis, which is really correlated to the liturgical things that comes up in the Liber Pontificalis. And the other thing is the Anonymous Valesianus, the second part of the Anonymous Valesianus, which really stressed the role of the papacy. And I believe it was produced in either Ravenna or Verona. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that the Liber Pontificalis actually started in the north, in Ravenna or Verona, and later was, taken over by Rome and readapted and so on and so forth.
Oh,
just
thank you for that suggestion. That's it adds a little bit of weight to the puzzle that's presented by the Verona Manuscript 22, certainly. It might well be the explanation. Yeah.
If no one wants to, thanks. If no one wants to ask anything, I have a few questions. But I'll start with the first one. In your book, you call the Liber Pontificalis an act of transforming an archive into a historical narrative. And I wonder if you see this process happening with other, let's say, maybe separate bits of information or biographies that are turned into either one more or less cohesive narrative, or even such a dossier of, you can take bits of it and use it for other things. And specifically what I have in mind is, let's say, things like the different Frankish legal corpora, or other barbarian leges babaum.
Right. You mean the degree to which they might or might not have added or been drawn on by compilers of historical narratives? I mean, in a sense, the Liber Pontificalis is distinctive in including material that has to do with a lot of legislation as well. But having said that, if you think of the way Eusebius constructs the ecclesiastical history, especially in Rufinus's version, there is quite a concentration on piecing together in a documentary fashion the material you can find. And you could argue that that's what Bede does in his Historia Ecclesiastica and the Liber and the history of the abbots of Jarrow and Wearmouth as well. I think some historians are more obviously creating a narrative out of a dossier than others. We may get that impression more from the Liber Pontificalis because it is so very telegraphic sometimes. You know, it's an itemization often, almost a mnemonic to what you might know in more detail from elsewhere. But I think one of the very, very interesting aspects of it, once you start looking at the manuscripts of canon law, first of all, many manuscripts of canon law actually have the lists of popes in them, which seem to be directly taken from a Liber Pontificalis manuscript, but also the structuring of the canon law presentation of what we now call papal decretals, which were originally letters, which were answering particular problems that individual bishops had and then became incorporated into canon law. Those are also in pope order, and they're often presented in that, so that there is a structural and obviously visual correlation to make between canon law and the Liber Pontificalis, which gives it even more of a character of this archive narrative version of an archive. The other factor, I suppose, is that I may or may not be unduly influenced by the understanding that this is actually produced by the notaries. It's an administrative history in many aspects, but they're hammering home all these other points very repeatedly. But you know, you come away with a very, very distinct knowledge and understanding of what's going on, and a chronology which may be perfectly fabricated, but nevertheless that's what everyone's going to remember. And if then they use it in order to structure their canon law collections, you're going to remember it even better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What I also meant by that is it seems to me, and you suggested in your book as well, that this transforming of an archive into a narrative also creates an idea of an institution, and it gives it authority. And what I meant by mentioning the Frankish legal corpora is that it seems to me that they are made of different legal bits that are put together and added on to later on in order to create this idea of authority, of who has the authority to give the law. And maybe in this way I see a parallel.
That's a very interesting idea and way of thinking about it. And I think certainly the collection of Ansegis that's made in the 9th century would fit that really very, very nicely. what one might also need to think about is the degree to which any one text is actually to be seen in the context of other texts produced at the same time. People know that they're side by side. You're not supposed to think of them in isolation. So that if you have a bundle of them, and sometimes you even might be lucky, they'll put them in one manuscript for you. And sometimes we do have these dossiers where the Liber Pontificalis is one of a number, or you might have your Frankish laws, which are also included as part of something else. Then that also would fit this collective way of thinking, a compilatory way of thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Manu, if you're here.
Yes. How much variation is there in the lists between the manuscripts? And the second question is, how does someone who wishes to make a copy make a copy? That's a question of access.
Yeah. No, thank you, Manu. That's very useful questions. The papal lists don't vary hugely. They vary sufficiently to worry people, especially with the early series of popes up to the 5th century, or even before that, the order in which some come. There aren't huge variants. You know, Pope number 11 might be number 12 instead of number 13 or whatever. Duchesne actually prints quite a lot of the variant lists in his edition at the beginning of the book. How you make a copy is a really very interesting question. At one level, we don't know at all, because we've only got the copies that were made to try and work it out. We also have quite clearly a problem of so many later copies of a manuscript that's produced originally in the 6th century. Now, we get some clues. One is an interesting comment that Pope Martin makes in a letter that he wrote to Amandus of Maastricht, where he says to Amandus that the scribe that Amandus sent down to write and make copies of books, he doesn't refer to the Liber Pontificalis specifically, but just to make copies of things, the man was in such a tearing hurry that he didn't actually get all that he wanted done. And in any case, there weren't enough books in the papal library at the time for him to make the copies. It's quite a curious comment. But also, Pope Martin had sent Amandus a copy of the decrees of the Lateran Council of 649 on papyrus, and that was presumably a copy that could then be copied. Now, what we don't know is whether the Pope is deliberately controlling the copies initially of the Liber Pontificalis, and a copy is made in the papal writing office, and then they are sent out. We have some suggestions made. François Bugard has written a really nice article, particularly related to the 8th century lives, that they might have been sent out alive as a libellus, as a sort of, you know, here I am, the new Pope, and here's the life of my predecessor, present. The whole book might have been offered as gifts, in which case people could make copies of it. There's one instance that's very famous, that Bede, when he was writing the Ratione Temporum, quite clearly had a copy of the first version of the life of Gregory II to hand, but then he didn't have a copy of the later version that was made, which might suggest that the lives were sent out separately, or at least after the 6th century, they were sent out separately or sent out in bundles. There's also the possibility that people coming to Rome at particular moments make copies and take them home. But we don't know what the process was, whether they would be told to take a desk in the corner and we hope you've brought your own ink and your own parchment and get on with it, and we'll bring you some tea when you get tired, or what, or whether they say, no, you can only purchase the copy we have made. But what we do have are the copies that were made by these Frankish scribes and the editions that they made. Many of them are very, very interesting editions indeed. The B and the D texts in particular interpolates things which had to do with Frankish protagonists or related to Frankish matters. And those are these Frankish moments. We have 3 versions of the life of Stephen II in the 8th century, a Lombard version, the one that's usually thought to be the Roman one, and a Frankish one. The Frankish one and the original one are extremely rude about the Lombards, and the Lombard version, it removes all the opprobrious epithets of the villissimos and the, the absolutely appalling Lombards and how wonderful the Franks are, and it tones everything down. But that's 3 different versions. So this may be individuals coming to Rome, pilgrims, or people are sent. No, we also have a letter from Hincmar of Rheims, who writes to a friend saying, I want a copy of the life of Sergius II because I haven't got it yet, which also implies a life-by-life distribution. But the fact remains is that after life 94 of Stephen II, they were increasingly inefficient about it, or weren't as interested in the immediate contemporary politics. But what gets copied and recopied and epitomized is the early section up to life 94, or sometimes even the section only up to life 90. There are also indications, sorry, this is a long answer to your question, Manu, but it's a really, really interesting question. And one I do discuss quite a bit in my chapter 6 of my book. In the Liber Pontificalis copy in Lucca 490, there are some indications in the scribe's copy made in the 8th century that he was copying portions of a text and that they had stopped at certain moments, and then he would have new bits which were then added. So the 8th century lives and the 9th century lives do look as if they came in separate packages in libelli. But again, the actual process of procuring your exemplar is not known. All we've got is the later copies, and there's lots more work to be done and thought about. I mean, I only began to think about all these copies I was looking at when I was, and then in the process of writing my chapter. As you'll see, I mean, I've scraped the surface. There's lots more work for other people to do.
We have a question from Jessie Billett.
Yeah, I've just seen it. Yes. Okay.
Should I read? Do you want to read it maybe out loud?
Yeah, okay, I'll do that. So, hello, Jessie, lovely to see you. So he wants me to expand on that peccata versus peccatum in the Agnus Dei. He's looked at the Vetus Latina database while he's been listening, and both forms are indeed to be found in biblical manuscripts. But perhaps peccata in those manuscripts is a liturgical contamination. Well, that's an interesting idea. Theological implications are indeed perhaps not non-trivial. They are extremely interesting. I did talk about first of all, there's the textual issue. What it could suggest is St. John's version is the singular peccata, the sin of the world, and the sins of the world does alter one's perceptions considerably. And Rowan Williams, no less, suggested in a conversation to me that this actually might be a much more pastoral effort and a deliberate thing on the part of the Pope to make it plural. However, you're absolutely right that when you check the Vetus Latina biblical texts and the Vulgate texts, what I discovered when I was looking at them, that there is an Italian recension. It may be the copy of the text that was available in 7th century Rome, and we need to do a lot more work about the biblical text available to the popes in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. Now, a little bit of that work has already been done by Richard Pollard, who has done some analysis of the biblical quotations in the letters written by the popes to the Frankish kings from 739 onwards. And it's in our new volume, and please forgive the puff, but it's about to be published, of the translation of the Codex Epistolaris Carolinus, all 99 letters from the popes to the Frankish rulers, 739 to 791. And Richard there has actually analyzed the different biblical quotations, and there is undoubtedly a mixture. They're not just using what we might choose to call the Vulgate. And what is the Vulgate in the 8th century? That's a really difficult question to answer. Equally, we cannot assume that only the Vulgate is used. The Vetus Latina is still being used not only all over Italy, but also in Francia. And there are some elements and some books of the Old Latin versions which are also being used in the British Isles and in Spain. So the liturgical idea, I did wonder whether it might have come in from a lectionary, but there isn't an early enough lectionary text for me to check. So it remains really very intriguing and something that does need further pursuit. But the Bible in use in Rome in the early Middle Ages is a major topic. Tom Noble made a good start in his article. I recommend it to him. I've cited it in my book, but more work undoubtedly needs to be done. So thank you. And then somebody called Christy Pavey also has a question.
Right, before that, we have time actually for both questions. Mo Hadbi has a question, and then...
Okay, yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor McKitterick, for your talk. It was super extra interesting. I actually have a question about the interrelations between the Liber Pontificalis and the Veris Illustribus. So I was wondering about the description. You mentioned that the author actually chose the imperial way to present the emperors, but I was wondering whether perhaps there are similarities with the entries in the Veris Illustribus, since the popes actually hold like a double crown, right? They're political, but yet religious. And then I was actually more interesting to find out, you showed it in your presentation, that they sometimes actually attach the Veris Illustribus with the Liber Pontificalis. So I was wondering what were their thoughts about those two texts?
Excellent question, Moore, and absolutely spot on. I'm actually writing an article about this very topic right this minute, because there are indeed a number of early manuscripts which juxtapose De Viris Illustribus and the Liber Pontificalis. There is undoubtedly a parallel inspiration. The imperial one is one, but I think the De Viris Illustribus is indeed deliberately evocative as well. The one for Peter is most obvious because many elements of that are also incorporated into the Liber Pontificalis. It's undoubtedly a source of information for it. But I think there's also the association of Jerome, De Viris Illustribus, that's made by the authors of the Liber Pontificalis, because they provide two letters at the beginning which purport to be exchanges between Jerome and Damasus. So Jerome is also associated with the Liber Pontificalis. And we know that Jerome and Damasus are also very important for the Vulgate text. So this is something which will indeed strike chords in readers. They will make a connection, and it's a connection that's reinforced in the subsequent manuscripts. But as I say, I'm exploring it further. And I think you're absolutely right to have spotted it, so thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Christy Pavey.
Hi, thank you, Professor McKitterick, for your talk. It was really lovely to hear you speak about the Liber Pontificalis and your work. I had a question about transmission, so patterns of transmission. And I'm wondering, so you say that a lot of the manuscripts represent the first part of the text. And I'm curious if there's any difference in transmission, or if we can tell if there's difference in transmission between transmission that happened sort of after the creation of the first part compared with later transmission that is only interested in more of the earlier popes.
It's a really important thing to ask, but much more difficult to answer. I could illustrate it best, I think, by explaining a little about the way Duchenne approached the problem, because Duchenne was convinced that we have in two of the epitomes that were made in the, well, it may be made earlier, but that survive in 8th century manuscripts actually represented a first edition of the Liber Pontificalis, which was transmitted to Gaul in the first part of the 6th century. Now, there's been a lot of very, very recent discussion of this by two particular scholars, Matthias Simpel and also Andrea Veradi, who have completely different views. But we do know that it reached Gaul in the 6th century because Gregory of Tours knew it and used it as a model for writing the history of the bishops of Tours in book 10 of the Historiae, the 10 books of history. So he knew it. It's also referred to in one or two other 6th century texts, and it's also, I think, inspiring some 6th century collections of canon law with the lists of popes in, the ones that Manu was referring to. But the actually pinning it down better than that is really, really difficult, because the first epitome, the Felician epitome, which was, in Duchesne's view, a representative of the first edition, is possibly an epitome made in the 6th century, or it could be the date of its earliest manuscript, which is late 8th century. And the Canonian recension, which is epitome, which is called that because it ends with Conon, could actually more probably be, I think, 8th century. But Andrea Veradi has suggested that both those epitomes were actually produced in Rome, also in the 6th century, more or less, very, very soon after the full version. So the relationship between epitome and full version is also not clear. And the actual changes then are really hard. Now, when you start looking at the manuscript transmission, you're not getting lives 95, 96 and onwards in very many manuscripts at all. And they're all Frankish that we've got. If you look at the 9th century manuscripts, and you've got to wait until you get to the 11th century before you get an Italian one with those lives in as well. And there's more work to be done. These aspects simply have not yet been worked at. I think one of the issues with it is that there's been a lot of work on the 8th century lives. They're absolutely bursting with interesting information, popes behaving badly, popes moaning, Franks behaving badly, all kinds of activity going on. The 9th century lives have received a lot of very, very good attention, especially from Klaus Herbers. But the whole way these lives and the way they're transmitted, what is happening in each place, has not really been unpacked. I understand that, Carmela Franklin is doing some work on the 11th century manuscript and maybe unpacking or able to unpack this lost 9th century one from Bianchini's edition. But this is all work to be done now. I think in the past, people have been very interested with the descriptions. They have treated it as statements of fact, which is, I think, a very dangerous thing to do. And got really excited about the number of gold pots or the mosaics that have been installed or the particular silk draperies. Whereas actually what we should be looking at is asking the kinds of questions you've all been asking.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McKitterick, for this inspiring talk. I found it very inspiring, and I'm sure everybody else did. We have material for a few doctorate projects here. I will say a couple more words about our forum. If you want to join our mailing list, I just put our email, on the chat. As I said, our next meeting will take place in the end of April, on April 28th. And our speaker is Patrick Geary. So we move from paleography to genetics. And we will we will circulate the flyer very soon. And I highly suggest you join our mailing list if you want to receive that flyer. That's it. Thank you all for coming, and I wish you an absolute wonderful evening or morning or day, wherever you are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, Professor
Thank you, everyone.
McKitterick.